Part 2. Transforming Your Inner World. Chapter 3. The 6 Core Principles of ACT Acceptance and Commitment. Therapy is based upon 6 core principles which work together to help you achieve 2 main goals. A. To effectively handle painful thoughts and feelings. And B. To create a rich, full, and meaningful life. Part 2 of this book is mainly concerned with the first of these goals, transforming your inner psychological world. Part 3 of the book is mainly concerned with the second goal, creating a life worth living. As we progress through the book, we will work through these 6 core principles, one by one. But first, let's take a very brief look at all of them. Principle 1. Diffusion. Diffusion means relating to your thoughts in a new way, so they have much less impact and influence over you. As you learn to diffuse painful and unpleasant thoughts, they will lose their ability to frighten, disturb, or depress you. And as you learn to diffuse unhelpful thoughts, such as self-limiting beliefs and harsh self-criticisms, they will have much less influence over your behavior. Principle 2. Expansion. Expansion means making room for unpleasant feelings, sensations, and urges, instead of trying to suppress them or push them away. As you open up and make space for these feelings, you will find they bother you much less, and they move on much more rapidly, instead of hanging around and disturbing you. The official ACT term for this principle is acceptance. I have changed it because the word acceptance has so many different meanings and can easily be misunderstood. Principle 3. Connection. Connection means living in the present, focusing on and engaging fully in whatever you're doing. Instead of dwelling on the past or worrying about the future, you are deeply connected with what is happening right here, right now. The official ACT term for this principle is contact with the present moment. I have changed the term in this book, purely for ease of communication. Principle 4. The observing self. The observing self is a powerful aspect of human consciousness, which has been largely ignored by Western psychology until now. As you learn how to access this part of yourself, it will enable you to further transform your relationship with unwanted thoughts and feelings. Principle 5. Values. Clarifying and connecting with your values is an essential step for making life meaningful. Your values are reflections of what is most important in your heart, what sort of person you want to be, what is significant and meaningful to you, and what you want to stand for in this life. Your values provide direction for your life and motivate you to make important changes. Principle 6. Committed action. A rich and meaningful life is created through taking action, but not just any action. It happens through effective action, guided by and motivated by your values. And in particular, it happens through committed action. Action that you take again and again and again, no matter how many times you fail or go off track. So committed action is shorthand for committed, effective, valued action. It's important to remember that while these 6 basic principles can transform your life in many positive ways, they aren't the 10 Commandments. You don't have to follow them. You can apply them if and when you choose to. So play around with them. Experiment. Test them out in your life and see how they work for you. And don't believe they're effective just because I say so. Give them a go and trust your own experience. I should also warn you that as you work through this book, there is one key point I'll be repeating again and again. You won't change your life simply by reading this book. To do that, you will have to take action. It's like reading a travel guide about India. By the end of it, you have a lot of ideas about where you'd like to visit, but you still haven't been there. To truly experience India, you have to make the effort to get up and go there. Similarly, if all you do is read this book and think about the contents, then by the end, you will have a lot of ideas about how to create a rich, full, and meaningful life, but you won't actually be living one. In order to actually live a better life, you will need to follow through on the exercises and suggestions within these pages. So are you eager to begin? Then read on. Chapter 4. The Great Storyteller. This morning I held a fresh lemon in my hands. I ran my fingers over the bright yellow skin, noting all the little dimples. I lifted it to my nose and inhaled the delicious aroma. Then I placed it on a cutting board and sliced it in half. Picking up one of the pieces, I opened my mouth and squeezed a drop of fresh lemon juice onto the tip of my tongue. What happened as you read about that lemon? Perhaps you saw its shape and color, or maybe you felt the texture of the skin. You may have smelled the fresh lemony scent. You may even have found your mouth watering. However, there was no lemon in front of you, only words about a lemon. Yet once those words entered your head, you reacted to them almost as you would to a real lemon. The same thing happens when you read a great thriller. All you have in front of you are words. But once those words enter your mind, interesting things start to happen. You may see or hear the characters and experience powerful emotions. When those words describe a character in a dangerous situation, you react as if someone really were in danger. Your muscles tense, your heartbeat speeds up, your adrenaline rises. That's why they're called thrillers. And yet, all you are dealing with in reality are little black marks on a page. Fascinating things, words. But what exactly are they? Words and thoughts. Humans rely heavily on words. Other animals use physical gestures and facial expressions and a variety of sounds to communicate, and so do we. But we are the only animal that uses words. Words are basically a complex system of symbols. And a symbol means something that stands for or refers to something else. So, for example, the word dog in English refers to a certain type of animal. In French, chien refers to the same animal, as does cane in Italian. 3 different symbols, all referring to the same thing. Anything that we can sense, feel, think about, observe, imagine, or interact with can be symbolized by words. Time, space, life, death, heaven, hell, people who died thousands of years ago, places that never existed, current events, and so on. And if you know what a word refers to, then you know its meaning, and you can understand it. But if you don't know what a word refers to, then you don't understand it. For example, axillary hyperhidrosis is a medical term that most of us don't understand. It means sweaty armpits. And now that you know what axillary hyperhidrosis refers to, you understand the words. We use words in 2 different settings. In public, when we're talking, listening, or writing, and in private, when we're thinking. Words on a page, we call text. Words spoken out loud, we call speech. And words inside our head, we call thoughts. It's important not to confuse thoughts with the mental pictures or physical feelings that often accompany them. To clarify the difference, here's a little experiment. Take a few moments to think about what you're going to fix for breakfast tomorrow morning. Then, as you're thinking about it, close your eyes and observe your thoughts as they happen. Notice what form they take. Close your eyes and do this for about half a minute. Okay, what did you notice? You may have noticed pictures in your mind. You saw yourself cooking or eating, as on a television screen. We'll call these mental pictures images. Images are not thoughts, although they often occur together. You may also have noticed feelings or sensations in your body, almost as if you were actually preparing or eating breakfast. These, too, are not thoughts. They are sensations. You also probably noticed some words passing through your head, almost like a talking voice. Those words may have described what you intend to eat. I'll have toast with peanut butter. Or they may have said something like, I don't know what I'll have. These words in our heads are what we call thoughts. Therefore, thoughts equal to words inside our heads, images equal to pictures inside our heads, sensations equal to feelings inside our bodies. It's important to remember this distinction, because we deal with these internal experiences in different ways. We'll be focusing on images and sensations later in the book. For now, we're going to look at thoughts. Humans rely a lot on their thoughts. Thoughts tell us about our life and how to live it. They tell us how we are and how we should be, what to do and what to avoid. And yet, they are nothing more than words, which is why, in ACT, we often refer to thoughts as stories. Sometimes they are true stories, called facts, and sometimes they are false. But most of our thoughts are neither true nor false. Most of them are either stories about how we see life, called opinions, attitudes, judgments, ideals, beliefs, theories, and morals, or about what we want to do with it, called plans, strategies, goals, wishes, and values. In ACT, our main interest in a thought is not whether it's true or false, but whether it's helpful. That is, does it help us create the life we want? The story is not the event. Imagine that a police officer catches an armed bank robber in a dramatic shootout. The next day, we read about it in the newspapers. One particular newspaper may give a totally accurate account of what happened. It may have all the facts correct. The name of the police officer, the location of the bank, maybe even the precise number of shots fired. Another newspaper may give a less accurate account of what happened. It may exaggerate some of the details for the sake of drama, or just get the facts wrong. But whether the story is totally accurate or false and misleading, it's still just a story. And when we read that story, we aren't actually present at the event. There is no shooting actually taking place before our eyes. All we have in front of us are words. The only people who can truly experience this event are those who are present when it happens, the eyewitnesses. Only an eyewitness actually hears the sound of the shots or sees the officer tackle the robber. No matter how much detail there is in the description, the story is not the event, and vice versa. Of course, we know that newspaper stories are biased. They don't give us the absolute truth. They give us an angle on what happened, which reflects the editorial viewpoint and attitude of the newspaper. And let's face it, some newspapers are far more sensationalistic than others. We also know that at any point we wish, we can stop reading. If we're not getting anything useful out of the story, we can put down the newspaper and walk outside. Now, this may be obvious when it comes to stories in newspapers, but it's not nearly so obvious when it comes to the stories in our minds. All too often we react to our thoughts as if they are the absolute truth, or as if we must give them all our attention. The psychological jargon for this reaction is cognitive fusion. What is cognitive fusion? Cognition is the technical term for a product of the mind, such as a thought, image, or memory. Fusion means a blending or melding together. Cognitive fusion means that the thought and the thing it refers to, the story and the event, become blended. Thus, we react to words about a lemon as if a lemon is actually present. We react to words in a crime novel as if someone really is about to be murdered. We react to words like, "I'm useless," as if we actually are useless. And we react to words like, "I'm going to fail," as if failure is a foregone conclusion. In a state of cognitive fusion, it seems as if thoughts are reality, as if what we're thinking were actually happening. Thoughts are the truth. We completely believe them. Thoughts are important. We take them seriously and give them our full attention. Thoughts are orders. We automatically obey them. Thoughts are wise. We assume they know best, and we follow their advice. Thoughts can be threats. Some thoughts can be deeply disturbing or frightening. Remember Michelle, who was plagued by thoughts such as, "I'm hopeless, I'm a lousy mother, and nobody likes me." In her state of cognitive fusion, those thoughts seemed to be the gospel truth. As a result, she felt terrible. That's not surprising, you might think. With thoughts like that, anyone would feel upset. Certainly that's what Michelle believed, at first. But she soon discovered that she could instantly reduce the impact of such unpleasant thoughts by applying the simple technique described below. Read through the instructions first, then give it a go. I'm having the thought that. To begin this exercise, first bring to mind an upsetting thought that takes the form I am X. For example, I am dumb, I am such a loser, or I'm so incompetent. Preferably pick a thought that often recurs and that usually bothers or upsets you when it does. Now hold that thought in your mind and believe it as much as you can. Focus on it for several seconds. Notice how it affects you. Now take that thought, and in front of it, insert this phrase. I'm having the thought that. Now run that thought again, this time with the phrase attached. Think to yourself, I'm having the thought that I am X. Notice what happens. Did you do it? Remember, you can't learn to ride a bike just by reading about it. You actually have to get on the bike and pedal. And you won't get much out of this book if you just read the exercises. To change the way you handle your painful thoughts, you actually have to practice some new skills. So if you haven't done the exercise, please go back and do it now. So what happened? You probably found that inserting the phrase, I'm having the thought that, instantly gave you some distance from the actual thought itself. It helped you step back and observe it. If you didn't notice any difference, try it again with another thought. You can use this technique with any unpleasant thought. For instance, If your mind says, life sucks, then simply acknowledge, I'm having the thought that life sucks. If your mind says, I'll never get over this, then simply acknowledge, I'm having the thought that I'll never get over this. If your mind says, my bum looks huge in this, then simply acknowledge, I'm having the thought that my bum looks huge in this. Using this phrase makes you aware of the process of thinking. This means you're less likely to take your thoughts literally. Instead, you can step back and see those thoughts for what they are, words passing through your head and nothing more. We call this process cognitive diffusion, or simply diffusion. Cognitive fusion tells us that thoughts are the truth and very important. Cognitive diffusion reminds us that thoughts are just words. In a state of diffusion, we recognize thoughts are merely sounds, words, stories, or bits of language. Thoughts may or may not be true. We don't automatically believe them. Thoughts may or may not be important. We pay attention only if they're helpful. Thoughts are definitely not orders. We certainly don't have to obey them. Thoughts may or may not be wise. We don't automatically follow their advice. Thoughts are never threats. Even the most negative of thoughts is not deeply disturbing or frightening. In ACT, we have many different techniques to facilitate diffusion. Some of them may seem a bit gimmicky at first, but think of them like training wheels on a bicycle. Once you can ride the bike, you don't need them anymore. So try out each technique as we come to it, and see which works best for you. Remember, as you use the techniques, the aim of diffusion is not to get rid of a thought, nor to make you like it or want it. The aim is simply to see the thought for what it really is, a string of words, and to let it be there without fighting it. The technique that follows will call on your musical abilities, but don't worry, no one will be listening but you. Musical thoughts. Bring to mind a negative self-judgment that commonly bothers you when it comes up, for example, I'm such an idiot. Now hold that thought in your mind, and really believe it as much as you can for about 10 seconds. Notice how it affects you. Now imagine taking that same thought and singing it to yourself to the tune of Happy Birthday. Sing it silently inside your head. Notice what happens. Now go back to the thought in its original form. Once again, hold it in your mind and believe it as much as you can, for about 10 seconds. Notice how it affects you. Now, imagine taking that thought and singing it to the tune of Jingle Bells. Sing it silently inside your head. Notice what happens. After doing this exercise, you probably found that by now, you're just not taking that thought quite so seriously. You're just not buying into it as much. Notice that you haven't challenged the thought at all. You haven't tried to get rid of it, debated whether it's true or false, or tried to replace it with a positive thought. So what has happened? Basically, you have diffused it. By taking the thought and putting it to music, you have realized that it is just made up of words, like the lyrics of a song. The mind is a great storyteller. The mind loves telling stories. In fact, it never stops. All day, every day, it tells you stories about who you are, what you're like, what you should be doing with your life, what other people think of you, what's wrong with the world, what will happen in the future, what went wrong in the past, and so on. It's like a radio that never stops broadcasting. Unfortunately, a lot of these stories are really negative. Stories such as, I'm not good enough, I'm stupid, I'm so fat, I hate my thighs, my life is terrible, there's no hope for the future, nobody likes me, this relationship is doomed, I can't cope, I will never be happy, and so on. There's nothing abnormal in this. As mentioned earlier, research shows that about 80% of our thoughts have some degree of negative content. But you can see how these stories, if taken as the absolute truth, can readily feed into anxiety, depression, anger, low self-esteem, self-doubt, and insecurity. Most psychological approaches regard negative stories as a major problem and make a big fuss about trying to eliminate them. Such approaches will advise you to try to make the story more accurate by checking the facts and correcting any errors. Rewrite the story, making it more positive. Get rid of the story by repeatedly telling yourself a better one. Distract yourself from the story. Push the story away. Argue with the story, and debate whether it's true or not. But haven't you already tried methods like these? The reality is, such control strategies simply will not work in the long run. In ACT, the approach is very different. Negative stories are not seen as a problem in their own right. It's only when we fuse with them, when we react as if they were the truth and give them our full attention, that they become problematic. Since childhood, you've heard, "Don't believe everything you read." When we read about celebrities in the tabloids, we know that many of the stories are false or misleading. Some are exaggerated for effect, others are made up entirely. Now some celebrities take this in their stride. They accept it as part of being famous and don't let it get to them. When they notice ridiculous stories about themselves, they just shrug it off. They certainly don't waste their time reading, analyzing, and discussing them. Other celebrities, though, get very upset about these stories. They read them and dwell on them, rant and complain, and lodge lawsuits, which are stressful and eat up a lot of time, energy, and money. Diffusion allows us to be like the first set of celebrities. The stories are there, but we don't take them seriously. We don't pay them much attention, and we certainly don't waste our time and energy trying to fight them. In ACE-T, we don't try to change, avoid, or get rid of the story. We know how ineffective that is. Instead, we simply acknowledge, this is a story. Naming your stories. Identify your mind's favorite stories, then give them names, such as The Loser story or the My Life Sucks story or the I Can't Do It story. Often there will be several variations on a theme. For example, the Nobody Likes Me story may show up as I'm boring, the I'm undesirable story as I'm fat, and the I'm inadequate story as I'm stupid. When your stories show up, acknowledge them by name. For example, you could say to yourself, "Ah yes, I recognize this. That old favorite, the I'm a failure story." Or, "Aha, here comes the I can't cope story." Once you've acknowledged a story, that's it. Just let it be. You don't have to challenge it or push it away, nor do you have to give it much attention. Simply let it come and go as it pleases, while you channel your energy into doing something you value. Michelle, whom we met earlier, identified 3 major stories: the I'm worthless story, the I'm a bad mother story, and the I'm unlovable story. Acknowledging her thoughts by these names made her far less likely to get caught up in them. But Michelle's hands-down favorite technique was musical thoughts. Whenever she caught herself buying into the I'm so pathetic story, she would put the words to music and watch them lose all their power. And she didn't just stick to Happy Birthday and Jingle Bells. She experimented with a wide variety of tunes, from Beethoven's Fifth Symphony to the Beatles' Penny Lane. After a week of practicing this technique repeatedly throughout the day, she found she was taking those thoughts a lot less seriously, even without the music. They hadn't gone away, but they bothered her much less. Now you're no doubt brimming with all sorts of questions. But be patient. In the next few chapters, we're going to cover diffusion in much more detail, including how to use it with mental images. In the meantime, practice using the 3 techniques we've covered so far. I'm having the thought that, musical thoughts, and naming the story. Of course, if you don't like a particular technique, you can leave it. And if you have a favorite, you can stick to it. Use these techniques regularly with distressing thoughts, at least 10 times a day when starting. Anytime you're feeling stressed, anxious, or depressed, ask yourself, what story is my mind telling me now? Then once you've identified it, diffuse it. It's important not to build up great expectations at this point. At times, diffusion occurs easily. At other times, it may not happen at all. So play around with these methods and notice what happens. But don't expect instant transformation. If all this seems too difficult, just acknowledge. I'm having the thought that it's too difficult. It's okay to have the thought that it's too hard, or that this is stupid, or that it won't work. They're all just thoughts, so see them for what they are and let them be. That's all fine, you may say. But what if the thoughts are true? Good question. Chapter 5. True Blues. In ACT, whether a thought is true is not that important. Far more important is whether it's helpful. Truthful or not, thoughts are nothing more than words. If they're helpful words, then it's worth paying attention to them. If they're not helpful, then why bother? Suppose I'm making some serious mistakes in my work and my mind tells me, "You are incompetent." This is not a helpful thought. It doesn't tell me what I can do to improve the situation. It just belittles me. It doesn't inspire me to improve. It's merely demoralizing. If I really am making mistakes, then putting myself down is quite pointless. Instead, what I need to do is to take action, brush up on my skills or ask for help. Or suppose I'm overweight and my mind says, "You're a lump of lard. Just look at that belly. It's disgusting." This thought is not helpful. It does nothing but blame, disparage, and demoralize. It doesn't inspire me to eat sensibly or exercise more. It just makes me feel lousy. You can waste a lot of time trying to decide whether your thoughts are actually true. Again and again, your mind will try to suck you into that debate. But although in some instances this can be important, the vast majority of the time it is totally irrelevant. What's more, it wastes a lot of energy. The more pragmatic approach is to ask, is this thought helpful? Does it help me take action to create the life I want? If it is helpful, then pay attention. If it's not, then diffuse it. But I hear you ask, what if that negative thought actually is helpful? What if telling myself, I'm fat, actually prompts me to lose some weight? Well, if a negative thought does actually motivate you, then by all means make use of it. But almost always, self-critical thoughts of this nature do not motivate you to take effective action. Usually such thoughts, if taken literally, just make you feel guilty, ashamed, depressed, frustrated, or anxious. And usually people with weight problems react to these unpleasant emotions by eating more, in a futile attempt to feel better. In ACT, we place great emphasis on taking effective action to improve your quality of life. In later chapters, we'll look at how to do this. For now, suffice to say, thoughts that criticize you, insult you, judge you, put you down, or blame you are likely to lower your motivation rather than increase it. So when troublesome thoughts pop into your head, it may be useful to ask yourself one or more of the following questions. Is this thought in any way useful or helpful? Is this an old thought? Have I heard this one before? Do I gain anything useful from listening to it again? Does this thought help me take effective action to improve my life? What would I get for believing this thought? At this point, you may be wondering, how can you tell whether a thought is helpful or not? If you're not sure, you can ask yourself, does it help me to be the person I want to be? Does it help me to build the sort of relationships I'd like? Does it help me to connect with what I truly value? Does it help me to make the most of my life as it is in this moment? Does it help me to take effective action to change my life for the better? Does it help me, in the long term, to create a rich, full, and meaningful life? If the answer to any of these questions is yes, then the thought is helpful. If the answer to all of them is no, then it's probably not helpful. Thoughts are just stories. In Chapter 4, I discussed the concept that thoughts are basically just stories, a bunch of words strung together to tell us something. But if thoughts are just stories, then how do we know which ones to believe? There are 3 parts to this answer. First, be wary of holding on to any belief too tightly. We all have beliefs, but the more tightly we hold on to them, the more inflexible we become in our attitudes and behaviors. If you've ever tried having an argument with someone who absolutely believes they are right, then you know how pointless it is. They will never see any point of view other than their own. We describe them as being inflexible, rigid, narrow-minded, blinkered, or stuck in their ways. Also, if you reflect on your own experience, you'll recognize that your beliefs change over time. That is, the beliefs that you once held tightly, you may now find laughable. For instance, at some point you probably used to believe in Santa Claus, the Easter Bunny, the Tooth Fairy, or dragons, goblins, and vampires. And almost everyone changes some of their beliefs about religion, politics, money, family, or health at some point as they grow older. So by all means, have your beliefs, but hold them lightly. Keep in mind that all beliefs are stories, whether or not they're true. Second, if a thought helps you to create a rich, full, and meaningful life, then use it. Pay attention to it, and use it for guidance and motivation. And at the same time, remember that it is still just a story, a bit of human language. So use it, but don't clutch it too tightly. Third, one of the core principles of ACT involves learning to pay careful attention to what is actually happening, rather than just automatically believing what your mind says. For example, you may have heard of the imposter syndrome. This is where someone who does his job competently and effectively believes that he's just an imposter, that he doesn't really know what he's doing. The imposter thinks of himself as a fraud, a fake, a charlatan, bluffing his way through everything, always on the verge of being found out. In the imposter syndrome, people are not paying enough attention to their direct experience, to the clearly observable facts that they are doing their job effectively. Instead, they are paying attention to an overcritical mind that says, "You don't know what you're doing. You're screwing up. Sooner or later, everyone will see through you because you're a fake. High-profile examples of people who have experienced the imposter syndrome, even while being phenomenally successful in their careers, include the rock star Robbie Williams and the Oscar-winning actress Renee Zellweger. In my early years as a doctor, I used to suffer from it too. If one of my patients said, "Thank you, you're a wonderful doctor," I used to think, "Yeah, right. You wouldn't say that if you knew what I'm really like." I could never accept such compliments, because I was convinced that deep down I was totally incompetent. In reality, I did my job very well, but my mind kept telling me I was useless, and I believed it. Whenever I made a mistake at work, no matter how trivial, 2 words would automatically blaze into my head: I'm incompetent. At first, I used to take the words quite seriously. I'd get really upset, believing they were the absolute truth. Then I'd start doubting myself and stressing out about all the decisions I'd made. Had I misdiagnosed that stomachache? Had I prescribed the wrong antibiotic? Had I overlooked something serious? Sometimes I would argue with the thought. I'd point out that everyone makes mistakes, including doctors, and that none of the mistakes I made was ever serious, and that overall, I did my job very well. At other times, I would run through lists of all the things I did well, and remind myself of all the positive feedback I'd had from my patients and work colleagues. Or I'd repeat positive affirmations that I was, indeed, highly competent. But none of that got rid of the negative thought, or stopped it from bothering me. These days, the same 2 words still often pop up when I make a mistake. But the difference is now they don't bother me, because I don't take them seriously. I know that those words are just an automatic response, like the way your eyes shut whenever you sneeze. The fact is, we don't choose most of the thoughts in our head. We do choose a small number of them, when we're actively planning or mentally rehearsing or being creative. But most of the thoughts in our head just show up of their own accord. We have many thousands of useless or unhelpful thoughts every day. And no matter how harsh, cruel, silly, vindictive, critical, frightening, or downright weird they may be, we can't prevent them from popping up. But just because they appear doesn't mean we have to take them seriously. In my case, the I'm incompetent story was there long before I became a doctor. In many different aspects of my life, from learning to dance to using a computer, any mistake I've made has triggered the same thought: I'm incompetent. Of course, it's not always those exact words. Often it's variants on the same theme, such as, idiot, or there you go, screwing up again, or can't you do anything right? But these thoughts are not a problem, as long as I see them for what they really are. Just a few words that popped into my head. Basically, the more tuned in you are to your direct experience of life, rather than to your mind's running commentary, the more empowered you are to take your life in the direction you truly want. In later chapters, you will learn how to develop this ability. The stories never stop. The mind never stops telling stories, not even when we're asleep. It is constantly comparing, judging, evaluating, criticizing, planning, pontificating, and fantasizing. And many of the stories it tells are real attention grabbers. Time and time again we get lost in these stories, a process for which we have many different expressions. We speak of indulging a thought, entertaining a thought, struggling with a thought, flirting with a thought, buying into a thought, being wrapped up in thoughts, lost in thought, and being carried away by thoughts, to name but a few. All these expressions point to how thoughts occupy our time, energy, and attention. Most of the time, we tend to take our thoughts far too seriously and give them far too much attention. The following exercise demonstrates the difference between attaching importance to a thought and not taking a thought seriously. Not taking a thought seriously. Bring to mind a thought that normally upsets you. That takes the form I am X. For example, I am inadequate. Hold that thought in your mind and notice how it affects you. Now bring to mind the thought, I am a banana. Hold it in your mind and notice how it affects you. What did you notice? Most people find that the first thought bothers them, but the second thought makes them grin. Why? Because you don't take the second thought seriously. But if the words following I am are a loser, a failure, a fat pig, or a boring person instead of a banana, we tend to attach far more importance to them. And yet they are all just words. One simple way of taking your thoughts less seriously is to try thanking your mind. This is a simple and effective diffusion technique. When your mind starts coming up with those same old stories, Simply thank it. You could say to yourself, silently, things like, "Thank you, mind. How very informative." Or, "Thanks for sharing." Or, "Is that right? How fascinating." Or simply, "Thanks, mind." When thanking your mind, don't do it sarcastically or aggressively. Do it with warmth and humor, and with a genuine appreciation for the amazing ability of your mind to produce a never-ending stream of thoughts. You could also combine this technique with naming the story. Ah yes, the "I'm a failure" story. Thanks so much, mind. Below is another technique that will help you take your thoughts less seriously. Read through the instructions first and then give it a go. The silly voices technique. This technique is particularly good with recurrent negative self-judgments. Find a thought that upsets or bothers you. Focus on the thought for 10 seconds, believing it as much as possible. Notice how it affects you. Then pick an animated cartoon character with a humorous voice, such as Mickey Mouse, Bugs Bunny, Shrek, or Homer Simpson. Now bring the troubling thought to mind, but hear it in the cartoon character's voice, as if that character were speaking your thoughts out loud. Notice what happens. Now get the negative thought back in its original form, and again, believe it as much as possible. Notice how it affects you. Next, pick a different cartoon character or a character from a movie or television show. Consider fantasy characters such as Darth Vader, Yoda, Gollum, or someone from your favorite sitcom, or actors with distinctive voices, such as Arnold Schwarzenegger or Eddie Murphy. Once again, bring the distressing thought to mind and hear it in that voice. Notice what happens. After doing this exercise and then repeating it, you've probably found that you're not taking that negative thought quite so seriously. You may even have found yourself grinning or chuckling. Notice that you haven't tried to change the thought, get rid of it, argue with it, push it away, debate whether it's true or false, replace it with a more positive thought, or distract yourself from it in any way. You have merely seen it for what it is, a bit of language. By taking that segment of language and hearing it in a different voice, you become aware that it is nothing more than a string of words, and thus, it loses its impact. This may remind you of a rhyme we learned as children: "Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words can never hurt me." Unfortunately, as children we couldn't put this into practice all that well, because no one ever taught us diffusion skills. A client of mine, we'll call her Jana, who suffered from depression, found this method extremely helpful. She had grown up with a verbally abusive mother who constantly criticized and insulted her. The insults that had once come from her mother had now turned into recurrent negative thoughts. "You're fat. You're ugly. You're stupid. You'll never amount to anything. Nobody likes you." When these thoughts came to mind during our sessions, Jana would often start crying. She had spent many years and thousands of dollars in therapy, trying to get rid of these thoughts, all to no avail. Jana was an avid fan of the comedy troupe Monty Python, and the character she picked was from their film, The Life of Brian. In the film, Brian's mother, played by the male actor Terry Jones, is always criticizing Brian in a ridiculously high-pitched, screeching voice. When Jana heard her negative thoughts in the voice of Brian's mother, she couldn't take them seriously. The thoughts did not immediately disappear, but they quickly lost their power over her, and this contributed significantly to lifting her depression. But what if a thought is both true and serious? For instance, if you are dying from cancer and have the thought, "I'll be dead soon." From an ACT perspective, we are far more interested in whether a thought is helpful than whether it's true or false, serious or ridiculous, negative or positive, optimistic or pessimistic. The bottom line is always the same. Does this thought help you make the most out of life? Now, if you only have a few months to live, it's really important to reflect on how you want to spend them. What loose ends do you need to tie up? What do you want to do? And whom do you want to see before you die? So a thought like, "I'll be dead soon," could be helpful if it motivates you to reflect and take effective action. If that's the case, you wouldn't try to diffuse such a thought. You would pay attention to it and use it to help you do what you need to do. But suppose that thought becomes an obsession, and you keep playing it over and over in your head. Would it be helpful to spend your last weeks of life thinking all day long, "I'll be dead soon," giving all your attention to that thought, instead of to the loved ones around you? Now, for some people, the silly voices technique may seem inappropriate for a thought like this, because it might seem to be trivializing something quite serious. If that's how it feels to you, don't use it. But it's important to note that diffusion is not about trivializing or making fun of genuine problems in your life. Diffusion is aimed at freeing us from oppression by our minds, freeing up our time, energy, and attention so we can invest it in meaningful activities rather than dwelling uselessly on our thoughts. So, if I'll be dead soon, keep showing up and taking up all your attention, thus preventing you from connecting with your loved ones. Then you could diffuse it in a number of different ways. You could acknowledge, aha, here's the imminent death story, or I'm having the thought that I'll be dead soon. Or you could simply say, thanks, mind. And don't think you are going to have to spend the rest of your life thanking your mind or hearing your thoughts in ditties and silly voices. These methods are merely stepping stones. Down the line, you can expect to diffuse your thoughts instantly, without the need for such contrived techniques, although there will always be times when it's useful to pull them out of your psychological toolkit. When practicing diffusion, it's important to keep the following things in mind. The aim of diffusion is not to get rid of unpleasant thoughts, but rather to see them for what they are, just words, and to let go of struggling with them. At times they will go away, and at times they won't. If you start expecting them to go, you are setting yourself up for disappointment or frustration. Don't expect these techniques to make you feel good. Often when you diffuse a troublesome thought, you will feel better. But this is just a beneficial byproduct, not the main goal. The main goal of diffusion is to free you from the tyranny of your mind, so you can focus your attention on more important things. So when diffusion does make you feel better, by all means enjoy it, but don't expect it to. And don't start using it to try to control how you feel. Otherwise, you're stuck right back in the happiness trap. Remember that you're human, so there will be plenty of times when you forget to use these new skills. And that's okay, because the moment you realize you've been reeled in by unhelpful thoughts, you can instantly use one of these techniques to unhook yourself. Remember that no technique is foolproof. There may be times when you try them and diffusion doesn't happen. If so, simply observe what it's like to be fused with your thoughts. Merely learning to tell the difference between fusion and diffusion is useful in its own right. Diffusion is like any other skill. The more you practice, the better you get. So add the thanking your mind and silly voices techniques to your repertoire, and aim to use them between 5 and 10 times each day. At this point, don't expect any dramatic changes in your life. Simply notice what happens as you incorporate these practices into your daily routine. And if you're having any doubts or concerns, make a note of them. In the next chapter, we'll look at common problems people have with diffusion, and, more importantly, we'll learn how to overcome them.